Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for another Learning Our Landscape presentation. Today we have two speakers, so throwing a little bit of a curveball at you. To begin, the North Olympic History Center acknowledges that we do our work on the lands of the first peoples of this area, the Squalum, Makah, Quileute, and Hoh River tribes. We recognize the rich and important history of the tribal nations in Clallam County and commit our work to this land acknowledgement to work collectively to help preserve and share their histories. As always, we're going to record this presentation and it will be posted up on the Jamestown Tribal Library's YouTube page. Since we're doing two presenters today, if you can go ahead and type any questions you have into the chat box, we'll make sure to save time at the end of each presentation to get to those. So to begin with, we're going to have Julieta Martinelli from the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences at the University of Washington, talking about environmental threats of the Olympia oyster. Following that presentation, we'll have Allie Taylor, the THPO at the Jamestown Tribe, talking about what a THPO is. And so just a little bit of background, Julieta's presentation on the Olympia oysters kind of goes back to a couple months ago when we had the presentations about the picnic site, the archeological site located at the Jamestown Tribes Veterans Memorial. And you'll remember when we talked about that site that it was a shell midden that we got radiocarbon dates going back to 1100 years before present. And in that shell midden were large lenses of Olympia oyster shell, which are a relative rarity at archaeological sites in Western Washington. So it was really interesting to find those, to excavate them. And then we connected with Julieta, who is doing her work on Olympia oysters. And because there's not many old ones out there, and we had plenty of extra oyster shell, we gave her some of her shell for her studies. So with that said, I will go ahead and get out of the way and let you get started. Julieta, welcome.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thanks, David, for the introduction. Let's see. I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so to get started, as David was saying, today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the work that we've been doing with our team at the University of Washington, studying a bit of the ecological history of Olympia oysters, and in particular, focus on some parasites that actually bore into Olympia oyster shells. So they are aquaculture pests, and I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of how we started working on this project initially, and then how we started working on Olympia oysters and how all the shells from the archaeological middens come into the picture. So thank you very much for joining me. I am super happy to be able to share some information back with the tribe. As David said, I've been working with this material for a couple of years now, and it is incredibly valuable. So I'm very grateful for the support and generosity. Okay, so let's get started. Most of you probably know that when we talk about oysters from the West Coast, they are really well known for their pearly and shiny appearance. And a few years ago, our team started noticing that some of them started developing some blisters and bumps, like the ones that you see on the photo here. And those blisters are actually inside the shell, and they're filled with anoxic mud and feces from a very small worm. And our research allowed us to confirm a couple of years ago that the worm that is responsible for this very unappealing blisters is called Polydora websteri. So we were able to confirm that this parasite was actually found in Washington State for the first time. And if you look at the photo of the worm right there on the screen, it's pretty small, it's pink, it looks a little bit endearing, right? So it's it's hard to imagine that it would be actually a problem to aquaculture industries and to, restoration of shellfish. But we've actually learned that this worm and other worms related have caused trouble in many aquaculture farms and oyster restoration projects throughout the world. So in this map, you can see some of the regions in the world where this worm has caused trouble. There are very well-known examples from Australia and New Zealand, Hawaii. And when we started doing our research in the Pacific Northwest, we were focused on Washington, but also working throughout the West Coast from California to Alaska. And we've been trying to understand how many worms we were finding, what were the species, if we were seeing Polydora and other worms. And some of the results that we found for Washington State were particularly interesting. And so what you can see here on this diagram are all the different species that we found for Washington State. So we can see that we have Polydora websteri in our samples. We also have Cardia or Cardiella. And the interesting thing was that we found that 74% of the worms that we extracted from oysters in Washington belong to what we started calling a mystery worm. And we were calling it this way because it's a species that genetically doesn't match up with any other species that have been described so far. So we don't know what it is. We know that it's very similar and potentially closely related with Polydora websteri, but it seems to be very different. So finding this mystery worm in Washington State really got us thinking about the natural history of shell-boring polychaetes in the Salish Sea and in the West Coast. And that really got us actually thinking about when did this shell-boring polychaetes actually arrive in the Salish Sea? And to answer this question, we started working with two different hypotheses. The first one is that the shell-boring polychaetes were recently introduced, potentially with Pacific oysters when they were brought in from Japan in the early 1900s. And the other hypothesis is that these shell-boring polychaetes are maybe native to the Salish Sea. And they have been around for millennia. And we were actually looking at a species that is native and has gone undescribed. So to answer this question, of course, we had to shift our focus from Pacific oysters to Olympia oysters. Most of you probably know that Ollies are the native oysters in Washington State and all of the West Coast. And we know that their distribution was extended from Baja California to southern Alaska, and they were very abundant throughout their distribution. And around the mid-1800s, they started undergoing declines in their population, possibly as a result of overharvesting in the gold rush, and also a result of declining conditions in the Puget Sound, declining environmental conditions. So we know now that Ollies are, of course, very important ecologically and culturally in the Salish Sea, and they are species of concern in the state. They are the state oyster, and they are the focus of many restoration programs in different tribes and also in collaboration with different organizations such as the Puget Sound Restoration Fund. So there is a lot of conservation relevance, right, to studying the species and to trying to understand what might be some of the present or past threats to the restoration and recovery. So when we started focusing on this question about, when did these pests arrive in the Salish Sea, we started looking at different questions or different steps of this question for Olympia oysters. And the first one was to quantify some of these parasite traces in fossil and archaeological Olympia oysters. Another part of it was to create a chronological framework using radiocarbon dating. And David basically very briefly mentioned that some of these oysters from the archaeological middens were dated with radiocarbon. We also conducted some radiocarbon analysis as part of this project. And the last part of our project and our goals in answering this question was actually to collaborate with stakeholders and share this information. So hopefully some of it can be incorporated into management and restoration plans. So let's get started with the first part of our goals. And this is related to actually quantifying some of the traces in historical shells. So to do this, I collected or was given oysters from 4 different populations. And these were modern oysters from Sequim Bay that were given to me also by folks in the Natural Resources Department in the Jamestown Sklallam tribe. Also, I collected fossil oysters from Lynch Cove, and these oysters are of a Holocene age, so they are younger than 10,000 years. Of course, the archaeological oyster shells that, as David mentioned, come from the picnic site, from the tribe, and also some fossil oysters from the Pleistocene period that are around 100 to 125,000 years old. And these ones are from Bay Center, from Willapa. So 4 different populations that have different ages and have different origins. Some of them are fossils, some of them are archaeological coming from shell midden, and others are modern populations. So just to give you an example of some of the sites and some of these oysters and what they look like, I want to show you what the oysters from Lynch Cove look like. This is Hood Canal, and these are oysters that I collected in the low tide a couple of years ago. And as you can see from the photos, these oysters are usually covered by water. They're only exposed in the low tide, and I collected the samples from these assemblages here where we can see all of these oysters still encased in mud. The archaeological oysters were given to me by David, and this is basically what some of those oysters look like, how I got the material. They were mixed with other different species of clams, but lots of really good ollies that were in very good condition. And when I started looking at the archaeological and the fossil oysters, I immediately started noticing some of the worm traces that I was telling you about. So in these photos, you can see different images of oysters that have parasite marks. In the photo from the center of the image, you can see 2 holes that we interpret as the entry and exit holes that these worms usually do on oyster shells. And on the image here on the left, you can also see different worm traces, possibly a blister in one of these oysters from the past. So we actually started seeing many strong indicators that these oysters might have had these parasites. But in order for us to actually answer this question in a more accurate way, what we did was actually go to San Juan Islands, where the University of Washington has a CT scanner for biological material. And I did this work in collaboration with April, who is in the photo here. April is an undergraduate who was working with me over the summer. And you can see her here actually operating the CT scanner. And the main reason why we decided to use this equipment is because a lot of the fossil and archaeological shells are very brittle. They are fragile. They are unique and valuable material. So we didn't want them to break. And the CT scanner allowed us to actually see inside the shells in a non-invasive way and to reconstruct them, in a 360 way. So in these images, you can see how some of the scans look like. You can see that we actually had to protect the oysters very well before they went into the CT scanner. And then we created these images of all the different oyster shells stacked in a pile. I also have a video to show you, and hopefully you can see. Seems to be working. So in this video, you can basically see the whole pile of some of those shells and how we're able to reconstruct them in a 3D way. And this allowed us to see a lot of these traces from the parasites that they have on the inside. And after seeing all of these details, what we did was actually split this stack of shells into individual shells. And this is what some of the scans look like. So you can see that the modern oysters, we can see through the shell and see all of the traces of these parasites inside them. We can see a really great resolution on the archeological shells as well. And also in the fossil shells. So in some of the fossil shells, a lot of the definition was lost, but we had some specimens that we could follow each one of the burrows really, really well. And this actually allowed us to measure the length and the width of these traces. So you can imagine that even if we can see these traces in the archaeological and the fossil shells, there is no way for us to know if the species that was making them in the past is the same one that we have today. But we approached this question by actually measuring these traces and measuring their length and their width. And that would give us a really strong indication if the length and width were similar between the populations that have different ages. We're probably seeing worms that are at least very closely related because they were doing similar traces and they have a similar size, right? So what we found was that a lot of the lengths and width in these populations were absolutely identical. So they were statistically indistinguishable. You can see in these density plots the different burrow width and the burrow length for these traces created by the parasites in the 3 different populations shown here in different colors. And you can see that for both the length and the width, there is a really strong overlap in the 3 different populations. And this really indicates that these traces were pretty much identical between the modern oysters, the fossil oysters, and the archaeological oysters. And this was very unexpected and very exciting to see that we could actually reconstruct this interaction between a parasite and Olympia oyster going back to a few thousand years ago. And we were also super lucky because we were able to collaborate with Brian Atwater, who is a geologist at USGS and the University of Washington. And Brian took us to Willapa Bay to also have a look at some even older fossil assemblages there in Bay Center. And when we went with Brian to inspect a lot of the shells, we were also very lucky because we got approval from Tony Johnston, who is the chief of the local tribe there in Bay Center, to actually collect some samples that really helped us to have a broader and a better understanding of this situation. And when we started looking at all of these olis in Bay Center, we immediately noticed that many of them also had these traces from these parasitic worms. And this was really surprising because we're talking about shells that are 100 to 125,000 years old. So we're talking about biological interaction between these parasites and Olympia oysters that has been going on pretty much for, at least 125,000 years old. So they're definitely a normal part of these communities with Olympia oysters. And when we retrieve some of these shells, the whole process of actually cleaning the samples was very time consuming. You can imagine that the shells have been encased in this mud for more than 100,000 years. So all the sieving and cleaning process took us a few days to make sure that we were actually able to retrieve as many oysters as possible. And looking at these oysters and looking at the traces in them allowed us to reconstruct the prevalence of the infestation of these parasites in different populations over time. So in this graph here, you can see the prevalence of infestation that goes from 0 to 1, or you can also imagine it goes from 0 to 100 in the 4 different populations. The modern one from the Jameson-Sklallam tribe, the archaeological population also from the tribe, the fossil ones from Lynch Cove, and the fossil ones from Olympia Bay. And here we can see that in the past, these parasites have infested around 25 to 30% of Olympia oysters, and the range actually extends to about 50% if we also include the archaeological oysters. So this is really important because it gives us a baseline for the interaction between these parasites and Olympia oysters in the past. So we know that natural ranges of prevalence go anywhere between 25 to 50%. And this is really important because knowing this baseline actually helps us know what is very high infestation or very low infestation in modern populations. So we were really excited to be able to put together this sort of timeline for prevalence in the past. And the other thing that we were able to reconstruct was the oyster shell height in some of these different populations over time. And in this graph, you can see the shell height of different populations showed in different colors. And what you see here is basically a histogram in the back and a density plot in the front. They both have pretty much the same information. And what this graph actually shows us is that the shell height for the more modern populations of Olympia oysters shows that their actual height is around 3.5 centimeters for the most abundant oysters, whereas from the archaeological oysters, we found many individuals that were around 4 centimeters in height. I just want to remind you that these oysters were selected by humans. So there is, a bias there in the selection for oysters of a particular size. And from the oysters that we collected from Olympia Bay, we actually found that many of these individuals were over 6 centimeters in shell height. And we also found a lot of shells that were actually smaller, less or around 1 centimeter in height, actually suggesting and indicating that this population from Bay Center was very active in the recruitment process because there were a lot of juvenile oysters as part of this population. And the other thing that I wanted to share with you is a little bit of the chronological framework. So I shared with you what we found in terms of parasite traces in these different populations. And I want to show you also what our radiocarbon dating results look like. So we processed about 10 oysters from the Lynch Cove, the fossil population, and the archaeological population from the picnic site. And we found that the ones from Lynch Cove were around 2,000 to 3,000 years in age, and the ones from Jamestown also between 1,500 to 2,000 years old. I want to clarify here that these ages need to be corrected for delta R and calibrated. And I started working with an archaeologist at Penn State who collected some botanical materials in the Lynch Cove site. And that's going to help us understand better what the error in those radiocarbon dates is. It's possible that they're around 300 to 500 years younger than this plot suggests. But given that we have the samples from Willapa, it doesn't really make a huge difference because we know that these parasites have been interacting with these oysters for way longer than 3,000 years. And to wrap up my talk, I mentioned that an important part of this project for us is to actually share back this information with stakeholders. So I wanted to open it up now for questions to see if any of you that are in the meeting today had any ideas or thoughts about how this information could be useful for you, or if you think it could be something that could be applied to any of the ongoing Olympia Oyster projects at the tribe.
So my name is Allie Taylor. I'm the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, or THPO, for the Jamestown S'Klallam tribe. And today I'm going to give you a brief introduction on what a THPO is. So a Tribal Historic Preservation Officer is an NPS grant-funded position that assists tribes in preserving their historic properties and cultural traditions. Costs covered under this grant include staff salaries, archaeological and architectural surveys, project compliance review, comprehensive preservation studies, National Register of Historic nominations, historic places nominations, educational programs, and other preservation-related activities. Currently, there are 212 THPOs nationwide. So what does a THPO do? The THPO's main job duty is to perform project reviews to ensure local, state, tribal, and federal governments are in compliance with various federal and state cultural resource and historic preservation regulations, like Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act and Washington State's Executive Order 2102. This presentation will mostly focus on this job duty of the THPO, but some other job duties may include the assistance in consultation and repatriation of ancestral remains, management of tribal archival and archaeological collections, protection and monitoring of significant archaeological and cultural sites, conducting educational outreach events like this one, and conducting archaeological inventories of tribally owned lands. So I wanted to give you a brief overview of some of the cultural resource regulations the THPO ensures projects are under compliance with. The Archaeological Resource Protection Act, enacted in 1979, governs excavation of archaeological sites on federal and tribal lands and the removal and disposition of archaeological collections from those sites. It provides penalties for anyone who knowingly disturbs, excavates, or removes artifacts from these sites. Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act is the law I consult most frequently on. This law requires federal agencies to consider the effects on historic properties of projects they carry out, assist, fund, permit, license, or approve. If a federal project has the potential to affect historic properties, a Section 106 review will take place. This is where the THPO comes in and reviews the project's extent of ground disturbance and the likelihood to disturb known or unknown cultural resources. As a result of this review, a THPO may recommend cultural resource survey prior to ground disturbing work, or an archaeological monitor to watch ground disturbing activities, or an inadvertent discovery plan. So in the event of discovering cultural materials during ground disturbing work, there's a plan in place and details on the next steps to take and who to contact. NAGPRA, or the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, provides a process for the repatriation of Native American cultural items like human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, or objects of cultural patrimony to lineal descendants and culturally affiliated tribes. NAGPRA includes provisions for the intentional and inadvertently discovery of Native American cultural items on federal and tribal lands, and penalties for noncompliance and illegal trafficking or looting. Archeological and Historic Preservation Act required that federal agencies provide the preservation of historical and archaeological data, which might otherwise be lost or destroyed as a result of any federal undertaking. So I won't go too much in depth on the various state laws, but Executive Order 2102 is basically the same as Section 106, but for state undertakings. So anything involving state agencies or capital funding must consider projects' impacts to significant cultural and historic places, and there must be consultation with nearby tribes on these project plans. RCW 27.53 requires a permit to knowingly alter or excavate any historic or pre-contact archaeological resources on private and public lands within the state of Washington. So if anyone knowingly disturbs an archaeology site without a permit, it's actually a Class C felony. And there's similar laws put in place for human remains, graves, and cemeteries, and they discuss the penalties for knowingly disturbing, damaging, or excavating graves or excavating remains from graves or cemeteries. So for project reviews, the Jamestown THPO typically receives project review requests from the area in blue on the map. This is approximately 4,000 square miles. The THPO actively responds to project review requests that come from the area in red on the map, which is approximately 1,500 square miles. These project review requests are for various development projects that have the potential to impact cultural resources. This could include a housing development, fish culvert replacement, a timber sale, and much more. The bar chart is just a visual representation of the number of consultation requests the THPO has received since 2018, when Jamestown joined the THPO program. Orange indicates the projects on a local level, so projects under Executive Order 2102 or the State Environmental Protection Act, while blue indicates projects within the federal government, with the federal government involvement, and are mostly Section 106 National Historic Preservation Act compliance reviews. So these numbers look fairly consistent across the board for the first few years, with totals from 2018 and 2019 being 255. And in 2020, there was 285 project reviews. For 2021, we had 222, but there was a change in staff. So the data is only populated for 9 of the 12 months. And since I took over this position last year, there's been an average of 37 project review requests per month. So if I were to add this average and fill out the rest of 2021, the total would be around 330 project review requests. And then finally, in this last year, we had a total of 379. So the past 2 years have had a fairly significant increase in project review requests. And just to remind folks, these numbers are actually on the lower end of project reviews conducted by THPOs when you think of tribes closer to larger cities like Seattle. So what is entailed in a project review? Once a project review is received, the THPO reviews the extent of ground disturbance proposed and the archaeological inventory of the location. This is typically done by reviewing a statewide database termed WIZARD, the Washington Information System for Archaeology and Architectural Resources Database. It's quite a mouthful. This information helps the THPO to determine where known archaeology sites or places of cultural significance are located and when there's a high likelihood to encounter cultural resources. Other information that's helpful during project review is tribal knowledge. Examples of this could be me contacting a tribal elder or the culture committee about the importance of a specific area. The THPO also reviews historic documentation, including ethnographic records, historic U.S. Geographic Survey maps, General Land Office maps, Bureau of Land Management land patents, and so much more. The THPO reviews as much information as possible to help guide them in a response to these project review requests. So the map on the right-hand side is a great example of a compilation of several types of this information. This was made by georeferencing historic U.S. Geographic Survey maps. We've mapped where previously recorded prairies and wetlands would be on the landscape today. This map also includes slalom place names that were found in various ethnographic records. So if I were to take this map and add in previously recorded archaeology sites, known historic village locations, and any information tribal members may share with me on culturally significant locations, I'd have a really good indication of what areas on today's landscape are of importance and when to recommend an archaeological survey, archaeological monitoring, or an inadvertent discovery plan in response to these project reviews. I personally have experience in archaeology and conduct surveys, monitoring for Jamestown projects when they are in high probability locations. This really varies among tribes or tribal THPOs, and some of them might contract out this archaeological work or hire staff specifically to conduct this type of work. So this photo is an example of the previous map with a georeferenced historic prairies and wetlands, along with some culturally important locations added in. I did make the icons a bit larger on purpose to protect the exact locations. But this information is forever changing as new archaeology sites can be identified at any time. So it's part of the THPO's job to keep an inventory of this data and update it as needed. This is something we're still working on, and I'm still compiling a lot of information with the assistance of the Jamestown Geographic Information Specialist. I've slowly been adding into a geospatial database this information. And it's my goal to obtain the relevant data from the state's database as well and combine it with the tribe's information so we can have as full of an inventory as possible. And so what you're looking at now is just the start of this process. So this is just the tribal information I've compiled so far, and it doesn't have any of the state database information in it yet. Now that we've covered project review and archaeological inventory tasks, one of the other job duties of the THPO is the management of the Jamestown Slalom archaeological collections, which currently houses collections from 18 archaeology sites in the area. Work that involves these collections includes accessioning and cataloging the artifacts, storing them in appropriate materials to ensure preservations of the objects, and sometimes even photographing objects for display on the tribe's online museum, the House of Seven Generations, or deaccessioning objects so they can be put on display in an exhibit like we plan to do for our new library. The THPO also manages the Jamestown Archives, which houses tribal governmental records, including federal recognition papers, enrollment documents, archaeological site records, maps, and excavation forms, old tribal publications like annual reports, newsletters, and calendars, and photographs from tribal citizens and different tribal events, and old publications and maps, and just a lot more. It's also part of the THPO's duties to protect culturally important sites, which often means site condition monitoring. This is a practice where the THPO visits the location one or more times a year to document the site's condition. And if the site's condition starts to deteriorate, the THPO may suggest some sort of mitigation, such as trail work or the removal of graffiti done at, and this is just an example of Tomanos Rock. So we did some trail work and removed graffiti from there a while back. I currently try to check on 8 sites annually to semi-annually when I have the time, but I'm sure the number of sites I check on will increase over time. So I think this covers the majority of the THPO's job duties, and I want to specify that while this position is grant funded and there are necessary tasks a THPO must complete for funding, each THPO at every tribe may have different tasks. So since my background is in archaeology and GIS, I focus more on cultural surveys and monitoring, site condition monitoring and inventory. Other THPOs may do a lot more public outreach or cultural events. Others may focus more on collections and archival management. So that's all I have. Thank you all for listening to my presentation. And if you have any questions, let me know.
Thank you both again for presenting today. Greatly appreciate it. And yeah, thanks everybody for tuning in. Next month, we will be chatting with Kathy Duncan, Jamestown Tribal Elder, about artifacts from the Sequim Bypass archaeological site in Sequim. So please tune back in on December 8th at 3 p.m. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.